Today we have Fabio Vicini with us. Shall we start? We met Fabio in our workshop in Switch Institute with Karim. Elvira started. In our workshop, he talked about anthropology of Islam, and we were all impressed with Karim and other friends. And we said, why don't we invite him to our beloved institute? So today, talk about is there a space for reflection in the anthropology of Islam and assessment? This is the title of this talk. Fabio Vicini is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at Istanbul University. Previously, PhD fellow at Berlin Graduate School, Muslim Cultures and Societies and Zentrum Moderne Orient, and İttifakı postdoc fellow. He has received his PhD in anthropology and history in 2013 from the Institute of Human and Social Sciences, Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa.
It's fine.
His dissertation has won the Middle East Studies Association's 2013 Malcolm Kerr Award in Social Sciences. Vicini's work is located at the cutting edge of interdisciplinary inquiry in anthropology, Islamic studies, and social theory. His work has appeared in journals as diverse as Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Culture and Religion, Sociology of Islam, British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. So, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for this very nice presentation. Hopefully I will be able to keep up with the expectations you have created in your students. And hopefully you can hear also my voice. I've been sick in the last month and so I hope my voice will last enough. Here I'll make circulate a special issue I've recently edited about Sufism, actually. And I will make reference to this briefly in my presentation. So today's presentation is about basically my research, my PhD research, so a stage in which maybe many of you are right now at the moment. My research fieldwork took place in 2010, and it was mainly based on fieldwork research on one Nur community here in Istanbul. The name of the foundation is Sufa Vakfı. I don't know, I guess many of you are confident with the Nur movement, but maybe not, because you're not all from Turkey. So anyway, the Nur movement is a revivalist Islamic movement that emerged at the beginning, so after the foundation of the Republic, and was established by Said Nursi, was a very prominent some Islamic scholars. And actually, who wrote this very important work, his magnus opus, which is the Risale-i Nur, which is a tafsir of the Quran, in which basically he reinterprets the Quran in a way that, from his perspectives, is much more at peace with the times. And I will enter this aspect in more detail during the presentation. Anyway, the Sufa Vakfı is one Nur community, so of this network of communities, so there are many. It's one community is part of one of the branches of the movement, especially the branch of the so-called readers. So those Nur followers who mainly focus on the reading of the Risale-i Nur. So the main place of the Sufa Vakfı is in Süleymaniye, where you are going to move maybe in the near future, we'll see. Actually, during my fieldwork, I basically spent time with university students, so affiliated with the community and going to university. So I lived with them for several months. And I also attended regularly the reading meetings of the Risale-i Nur that took place in Süleymaniye every Saturday night. How did I approach this topic? This is important also because of the title of the presentation. So my first approach was, of course, to follow the mainstream theories in the anthropology of Islam, and mainly the so-called Assadian school. You are probably confident with the work of Talal Assad, and is groundbreaking, actually, work about the anthropology of Islam, and especially the work of his two main pupils, let's say. So Saba Mahmoud made this work on the movement of the mosque women in Egypt, and Charles Erskine, he also worked on Egypt. And basically, so one of the main questions, my main research question, if you allow me this expression, was how and what kind of Muslim subject is educated and constructed within this particular specific branch of the Nur movement. So this is the background, and I will start my presentation with short ethnographic extract. So, and then I will basically address two main points. So one is why this particular Nur community, but in general within the Nur movement, there is such an emphasis on meditative reflection, so tefekkür, basically. And so I will try to trace very briefly a genealogy of the idea of tefekkür. So what is the place of tafakkur in Arabic, in Islamic tradition, and why did it become so important within this particular movement. And then the second main part of the presentation will be more theoretical, and it will explore what are the theoretical implications for the anthropology of Islam, of this particular ethnographic case. What does this case tell us, about the anthropology of Islam, more broadly speaking? So I will start from the ethnographic excerpt. So basically, the time was October 2010, and I already spent several months in the houses of this community, and I had at the time became quite accustomed to the Safa Foundation's reading meetings. But this sense of acquaintance with the practices, with the reading of the Risale Nur, was accompanied by an uncomfortable feeling, because in my view, when commenting upon the Risale, the brothers of the community often repeated the same arguments and examples. And these examples were generally taken from the natural world. I will come to this quotation in a moment. So for example, several examples were made by the brothers, like for example, the fact that the man's memory is contained in a gland as big as a nut. Or it was often mentioned that the atmosphere was very thin compared to the important role it has in protecting the earth from the sun rays. Or, for example, very commonly, the brothers pondered upon the vastness of the universe. And all these examples taken from the observation of the natural world with a scientific jargon actually were used by the brothers to basically show how actually all these occurrences had to have a kind of main referent behind them. So for them, all these examples taken from the natural domain were basically proofs of God's existence, so that a God must exist behind such a reality. So contemplation on nature, so tefekkür on nature, and we come back to tefekkür in a moment, was basically this. So to reflect on these things and to achieve a sort of awareness that that a God, an entity must exist beyond all this. However, I mean, for me, with my, if you want, Western forma mentis, this kind of exercise became a kind of repetitive. I mean, and I was wondering, why are all the time repeating these kind of examples? I understood the point. So one night, actually, I was back from one of these Saturday meetings, and so I told to Farouk, one of the students living with me in the house. He was actually a student in law, if I remember correctly, second year student in law at Istanbul University. And I told Farouk that I found this strategy somewhat redundant, and that I would rather have expected that their readings would be associated with some other kind of more speculative or theoretical considerations. And in response, Farouk made the following statement. You can read it together with me. And he said, Abi, of course I was elder than him, so they called me Abi as well within the houses. And Farouk told me, Abi, think a little. Yeah, night has come. How has night come? Wow, from the morning the sky has darkened. It is a very basic occurrence, a monotonous one. It is like this. Since it has always been like this, it seems ordinary to us. But think a little, brother. Reflect a little. بالتفكر. Have you understood now why I gave you this concrete example? What do we say? We say, Abi, take this apple and reflect a bit on it. Look at the apple tree, that in springtime its apples comes out, that in autumn the leaves that fall, that after this every spring they come back to life again, that there is an entity bringing them back to life, that this entity is God, that the one ruling all the universe is Him, that He has created us from nothingness. Why I'm quoting this passage? Because for me, at the moment, in that particular moment, I really understood through this explication what actually the Noor brothers were doing during their reading meetings. And I realized how much actually the difficulty I had in understanding what they were doing was related to my upbringing in a Western country, in Italy. But without going too far from here, basically think also of your own lives. How they schedule every day. I mean, we are taken by our daily occurrences, by our daily schedule. We generally don't stop much, thinking about all these things. And so basically we got used to all these things happening. I mean, we got used to the fact that the sun rises in the morning and set in the evening. This kind of habit to these happenings is something, of course, related to modernization, if you want. Because the whole edifice of modernity since the Enlightenment has been based on the idea that God must be definitively separate from the worldly domain. As observed by a lasting tradition of inquiry in the sociology of religion that goes back to Max Weber, the same idea of modernization is grounded upon disenchantment, the Weberian thesis of disenchantment. So, namely, humans' final realization that extra-worldly forces do not intervene in the world and should not be taken into consideration by the modern self. So these views have been boosted by modern scientific discourse, and this disenchanted view of nature as an autonomous machine has profoundly affected people's gaze in regard to natural phenomena. In the West, as well as in the rest of the world, today people tend to look at these phenomena as normal, and they observe them in a very detached and objectifying manner. As a result, the passing of the daytime into the darkness of the night, with the descent of the sun and the rising of the stars in the firmament, to which Furqan refers, are commonly accepted by people as being routine and as not worthy of consideration. So basically, what are the Noor brothers doing with tafakkur, with reading, by reading the Risale? So mainly they are trying to subvert this perspective on nature, this modernist perspective, and they're pointing to the miraculous character of this apparently simple phenomena. And as observed by Abdel Rahman, so a sense of the wondrous and miraculous with respect to the seemingly most common and natural facts is at the basis of the kind of awareness that the Noor brothers aim to attain through the repeated reading of the Risale. So if this is clear until now, I go into my first point. So basically, what is the place of meditative reflection, tafakkur in the Islamic tradition? So I trace a very short genealogy of this And we try to point to why it became so important within the Nur communities. Because actually, reliance on reflection, so tefekkür, is not a novelty of the Nur communities, for sure. So the term tefekkür, so tafakkur, comes from the Arabic root afkir, as you know, which literally means to think. And in Islam, it has a genealogy, it is generally referred to the intellectual faculty of thought or of reflecting upon an object. So the word encompassed a broad field of intellectually based speculative practices within Islamic philosophy, but it was also important within Sufism. So generally today, when we think of Sufism, tasawwuf, we associate it with zikr, with the, the repentance of the God's names and a kind of ecstatic exercise. But especially in medieval theology and philosophy, tafakkur could be potentially a way of achieving awareness of God as much as through zikr. I mean, they didn't see these things as clearly separated. With a caveat, and I will come to this, of course. So among the medieval scholars, actually, that dealt with tafakkur, probably the most detailed exposition of the practice is found in the chapter on meditation, Kitab al-Tafakkur, contained in the great Islamic theologian and Sufi scholar Hamid al-Ghazali's masterpiece, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, so Ihya Ulum al-Din. And in this section, Ghazali distinguishes tafakkur from ordinary thinking. And basically he says, ordinary thinking is a pure logical exercise that is merely aimed at drawing cause-effect relations from the observation of natural phenomena. So it's something very similar to what basically scientists are trying to do, to simplify. And he distinguished it from tafakkur. And tafakkur instead was intended as the amplification of reflection with respect to either human qualities and action or God's creation. So God's creation meaning, of course, the natural world, so the universe, basically. For Ghazali, the way the divine attributes of God become refracted across the cosmos from the universe to human existence, because of course, also we as human beings are part of the cosmos. And so we reflect God's qualities. All this, for Ghazali, was a particularly fertile ground for tafakkur, for reflection. So Ghazali held this kind of meditative reflection in very high regard, even thinking that it could be of a potentially greater benefit than dhikr with regard to how Muslims could firmly root the Islamic faith in their heart. However, and this is the caveat, and that's why basically tafakkur with time was a little bit forgot also in the Sufi tradition. He was also worried by its potential for deception, because in particular Ghazali strictly warned against the reliance on tafakkur when it came to the innermost essence of God. So he said, you cannot make tafakkur directly on the same idea of God. Because reflection in this matter had been already forbidden by the Prophet Muhammad, who had clarified that the human mind is too limited in capacity to be able to grasp God's essence. For this reason, the practice has generally been considered sinful in Islam ever since, and any such attempt believed to lead either to heresy or to madness. And because of the perils, of the risks that tafakkur may imply, that's why, especially within Sufi tradition, it had always been looked with kind of suspicion. And that's why the tradition of dhikr has been much more developed. And indeed, the Sufi authority par excellence, so Muhammad ibn Arabi, he insisted, and he had a negative opinion about fikr, about tafakkur, because he envisaged the risk of a drift toward rationalism. So a risk to go into philosophy, a risk of giving too much confidence to human reason, actually. So from this very brief excursus, it emerged that while medieval Muslim scholars recognized the importance of reflection in Islamic heuristic path, they also generally agreed upon the fact that an excessive reliance on reflection could be misleading. But paradoxically, it was for exactly the same reason that actually Said Nursi instead decided to establish its own method to contemplate, basically, God upon tefekkür, and distinguishing it from dhikr. I mean, there are sections in the Risale in which basically said, we don't have to engage in zikr, we have to engage in tefekkür. And he make a distinction in even more radical terms than the same medieval scholars would have done at the time. So, and in this, I think Nursi was for sure influenced by the context. I'm a social scientist after all. And I think that, you know, in Republican times, Sufism was seen as kind of backward. It was rejected by Kemalism. And so basically Nursi, also strategically maybe, he may have tried to hide the Sufi background from which he actually came. And indeed, the entire article in the special issue I'm making you circulate is about this, about actually how tefekkür has a modernist emphasis in it, and I'll come to this in a moment, but how actually the practice is very much related to reflection on the cosmos in a way very similar to how Ibn Arabi conceived the imagination, khayal. So there is not much difference after all. If you look underneath the surface of the words that have been used, there are very much similarities underground working, and I show this in the article, but I can't enter this into detail here. So basically, my argument is that Said Nursi, because of the more immediate semantic resonance of fiqh with a modern epistemology, enlightening reasoning over more exoteric practices such as zikr, offered the safest haven for Nursi. To him, tefekkür seemed to be more consonant with the epistemological shifts that were brought about by modernity, and for this reason he opted for establishing the Nur path on this kind of meditative practice. So anyway, in this article I also explain how for him tefekkür was a practice that still had to be not purely rational. So he also was afraid of the risks of giving too much reliance on reflection, and that's why he also emphasized the importance of the heart as the center of our spiritual life. So he said, when we conduct tefekkür, we have also to rely on the heart in order to basically guide our reflective capacities toward a comprehension, understanding that beyond this worldly reality there is basically God. So he was aware of all the risks of excessively rationalizing tefekkür, okay? But he preferred to use tefekkür because he thought it was much more consonant with modern discourse about reasoning and reflection. So in this sense, to conclude on this point, Nursi's was an attempt at, if you want, accommodating modernity by fitting long-standing meditative practices into an only apparently modernist framework.
Can you repeat again your conclusion?
So Nursi's was an attempt at accommodating modernity by fitting long-standing meditative practices. So all these meditative practices I talked about, so Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, into an only apparently modernist framework. So it was more strategical move, I would say, but we can discuss this. I mean, it was not just actually strategical. I mean, if you look at Nursi's biography, you can see how he approached, generally speaking, the Islamic tradition in a very alternative, new way. Since when he was a child, actually, he refused traditional authority. and he wanted to read books fast and go on with knowledge. So he already has this kind of modernist attitude. But however, his main philosophical, theoretical, theological discussions about reflection, I think they're very much in depth to Islamic tradition. I don't see a clear rupture. I see a continuity. That's what I'm trying to say. How much time do I have still? I can go on. And now finally I come to the theoretical issue. So the second main point of this presentation. So what are the theoretical implications that the case here considered? And the emphasis on tafakkur, in particular, have for the anthropology of Islam. So probably this is the main reason why you are here. So let's talk about the anthropology of Islam. And with particular regard to the Assadian school, in particular. Very briefly about the Assadian school. So Al-Assad's contribution was groundbreaking, okay, in the anthropology of Islam. Why? Because in 1986, he wrote this occasional paper, so a paper like not even published in a proper journal, actually, at Georgetown University. But this paper became seminal for the debates in the anthropology of Islam and beyond them. Basically, in this essay, he introduced the idea that Islam would be best understood as a discursive tradition. And this idea of tradition, it basically, even if he doesn't recognize it very openly, he took it from Alasdair MacIntyre's work. We'll maybe mention him later again. So he was a virtue ethicist, was a philosopher that tried to recover the tradition of Aristotle in moral philosophy, basically. Anyway, why the idea of discursive tradition was so important in seminal debates in anthropology of Islam? Because basically this idea provided the discipline with a useful tool for overcoming the deadlock between the two main threads of inquiry that were dominant at the time. Because on the one hand, we had a trend in anthropology of Islam that emphasized the cultural specificity and thus incommensurability of multiple local historical manifestations of Islam. For example, Abdul Hamid al-Zain was a supporter of this position, and basically these authors were saying there is not one Islam. There are many Islams, because Islam has been shaped by local contexts. So we cannot talk of one Islam, there are many multiple Islams. This was one trend. The other trend was seeing Islam as social structure, that is, as a blueprint with some definitive traits which made it unadaptable to change. So the opposite view, so Ernst Geller's view, who wrote this very famous book, Muslim Societies, in which he basically said Islam is a blueprint, is a fixed thing actually, and it cannot change and it cannot be affected by modernity also. So a kind of opposite view. And why the idea of Assad, of discursive tradition, was so important? Because it actually solved the conundrum that was at stake here. Because I said, at the same time, Islam is one, but it's also multiple. How did he say this? He said, Islam is one, because the key texts, the key reference texts of Islam are the Quran and the Hadith tradition. And then all the fiqh, so all the entire Islamic tradition. But basically said, every Muslim, everywhere in the world, whatever is his particular specific understanding of Islamic tradition, will always refer to this key text, to the Quran and the Hadith. Yani yapacak bir şey yok, basically. And then basically said, however, of course, then tradition is locally interpreted through processes of power and authority. So local, important religious figures, imams or muftis, will interpret in a specific way the tradition. But still the key reference will be the Quran and the Sunnah. And in my particular case, I keep tradition, the idea of tradition, for me is very important. And on this, I'm totally with Al-Assad. And in my particular case, of course, so Said Nursi is a local interpreter of Islamic tradition. So he gives his own particular understanding in the Risale-i-Nur. But, of course, his main references in the Risale-i-Nur are still the Quran and the Hadith. Yeah. So Assad's contribution was seminal, groundbreaking, was very innovative, and so he really initiated a new tradition of scholarship within anthropology of Islam. So the work of Lambeck, Brindley Messig, Starrett, Hefner, and then especially Saba Mahmoud and Charles Ishkind that I mentioned at the beginning. I go on until you don't tell me you have just 5 minutes left, okay? Okay, inshallah, we did it. Okay.
20, now it's been only 28.
Yeah, so it should be,
Yeah,
okay.
talk like 40 minutes, 40, 45.
Okay, thank you. So this trend has recently been, let me introduce this, questioned by a recent anthropological scholarship which has questioned the notion of discursive tradition. Because they basically say, with this notion of discursive Islamic tradition, too much emphasis is put on the coherence of Islamic tradition, and this impaired an understanding of Muslim life beyond the contours of religious commitment. So some have highlighted the ambivalences and inconsistencies that people who try to comply with the prescription or values of the Islamic tradition may endure. Otherwise, they have made the plain point that not all Muslims are pious people, so that there may be too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam. So this point was particularly defended by Samuli Shirke, who basically, studied Muslims in Egypt during Ramadan. He made some observation about how basically many Muslims and many Salafi Muslims during Ramadan commit very sinful practices, actually. And I don't enter into details. So basically saying, there are Muslims that may simply not comply with the tradition. So why should we give so much weight to this idea of tradition? And anyway, this trend of studies, others like Soares and Rosella emphasized how there is a risk in the Assadian approach to monothematize Muslim life, ending up with a post-Orientalist reification of culture. Yeah. Anyway, so they basically said the risk of new Orientalization of the Muslim subject in this scholarship. Anyway, this trend of studies is generally related to another trend of anthropological inquiry in the anthropology of ethics, actually. This Karim's, we discussed with you this topic. And basically, I will cut a little bit here because I know I don't have enough time to explore this. But one of the key authors of this tradition is Laidlaw. And basically, the ironic thing about this tradition is that it is grounded in the work of the so-called ethical turn in philosophy. So they are grounded in works like those of McIntyre's, upon which also Assad established his own scholarship. But however, similarly to Samuli Sherkes, these authors basically says that an excessive emphasis on Islamic tradition may put in danger our capacity of understanding how basically people takes moral decision in particular critical moments of their life. Because they say, if everything is about tradition and discursive tradition, then everything is reduced to how basically Muslims are instructed about how to live a Muslim life. But what about when it comes to how a Muslim has to face a particular ethical problem? For example, I don't know, a woman today in Egypt, Turkey, wherever, who has to decide, she's really in love with a person, let's say, She's really well-intentioned. She planned to marry this person, but she has an ethical doubt. How should I behave? Can I meet this person? Is it allowed by Islam? And all these kind of ethical dilemmas that a Muslim woman can have. And anyway, I think from this point of view, this critique may have a sense, because indeed, the Assadian scholarship may be limited some way to address this kind of problems. So it hasn't been conceived very much to address this kind of ethical dilemmas. However, what I don't like of this scholarship, in this I defend the Assadian tradition, then I will finally come to my critique to the Assadian tradition. So what I basically don't like of this tradition is that basically it risks of overemphasizing the individual moral subject. So by saying basically Islamic tradition is not so important, what is important is how people, in particular circumstances of their life, they take ethical decisions and so on. The risk is to give us a picture of the Muslim subject as a person without a tradition, which means without a main framework according to which they take their ethical decisions. So even if Muslim people have moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, they still need a tradition, upon which to ground their ethical solutions to the ethical dilemmas they have. So basically, to make a long story shorter, I think there is a risk in this scholarship of falling back on a very Western, if you want, European idea of the subject, as if we take our moral decisions without considering our own traditions, our own history. I mean, we are not people without an history that suddenly have to take an ethical decision about something, and we can choose among different traditions. Because this is one of the main points of Samouli's perspective, for example. He says, Muslims in Egypt can take, according to the ethical problem they have to solve, they can choose and pick either from a secular tradition of moral reasoning or from an Islamic tradition of moral reasoning. But what I'm saying is that these people have an history. They cannot easily get rid of their religious tradition and, put the suit of a secular tradition. Because it's their own life, it's their own narrative, and let me also make this specification. Of course, for me, and for my work, it was much easier to actually expose this kind of approach based on the idea of tradition, because I was dealing with people that, after all, they were willingly to submit themselves to a Muslim life. So my concern in my research wasn't the kind of ethical dilemmas that these people may have, but was much more how these people came to inhabit a Muslim life. So, there is also an empirical dimension here, as always in anthropology. So my inclination toward a kind of approach is also determined by, of course, my empirical case. But I think, what I said can be applied more broadly to this kind of debates. Now, I know it has been hard until now, and even if you have missed this last part, it's not very important, because my main point here is to talk about my own critique about the Assadian school. It will really last 5 more minutes, and then is done. So, as I said, in my work, I suggested, for several reasons I mentioned, that the notion of tradition is still useful, is still important. Because a complete refusal of the idea of tradition would present us with a vision of people as a tabula rasa, a view that would be deceptive for understanding ethical commitment in Islam, as well as in other traditions of ethical engagement. Now, going back for a moment to Assad's definition of a discursive tradition, I think that basically in his definition he insisted on mechanism of interpretation, argumentation, and authorization that are at work within traditions. And for this reason, I believe this definition is adequately immunized from the perils of offering a monolithic view of Islam, as these other anthropologists actually argue. So I think their criticism is not strong enough, basically. And the idea of discursive tradition still work. Rather, what I see as problematic, and here I come to my point, in Azad's definition, it is the normative band it contains, which is reflected in a certain obsession with the role of power and authority in defining authoritative religious discourses. This can be observed in the way Azad seems to reduce the function of tradition to prescribing the correct practices by seeking to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice. So this is actually from the 1986 essay by Al-Assad, and at this juncture of the text he asks, so what is a tradition? A tradition consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice that, precisely because it is established, has a history. So these discourses relate conceptually to a past and a future through a present. An Islamic discursive tradition is simply a tradition of Muslim discourse that addresses itself to conception of the Islamic past and future with reference to a particular Islamic practice in the present. So we can skip the second part of the definition. What is important for me is the first part. And you can already see from the words he's using, discourse, that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice. I think what is problematic from my perspective, I mean, to the extent that the case of the Nur community is illustrated, is a certain excessive emphasis on authority and power in this definition. Assad very probably influenced by the work of Michel Foucault. You know, he was very much influenced by his idea of discourse, authority and power. You are probably confident with Foucault, so I won't enter into this. But Foucault said, you know, power is, I mean, knowledge is power, and discourses are forms of power through which people, authorities impose on us an orthodox understanding of a tradition. And basically what he's saying here, Assad, is that local interpreters of the tradition basically impose on their publics, people listening to them, a particular understanding of the tradition. But not just an understanding of tradition, but also they instruct practitioners about the correct form and purpose of a given practice. So they really instruct, you know, you have to actually, if you want to be a good Muslim, you have to do that. You have to submit to this kind of practices. And actually, when, I don't know if you're confident with the work of Saba Mahmoud, but what emerges from her very famous ethnography is exactly this. I mean, she puts a lot of emphasis on discipline, and especially on the discipline of salat, so the namaz. She emphasizes how Muslim women come to inhabit a pious Muslim life by doing what? By practicing repeatedly their salat, which is a way for them to embody particular virtues, in particular the virtue of humility, which is a particular feminine virtue in her understanding of Muslim practice. And I'm not saying that namaz is not important. It was also important within, of course, the Sufa community. So all the students every morning, they woke up, they performed their namaz, they also wake me up, and actually they practice it, so it was very important. But they had a different understanding of the namaz, and if you want, you can ask about this. But For them, another practice was more important, and this practice was reading the Risale and practicing tefekkür. And what I'm trying to say here today is that basically, by putting too much emphasis on this power dimension, on this disciplinary dimension of the Islamic tradition, this kind of Assadian school misses the role of intellectual practice within Muslim practice. I'm not saying they're entirely denying it. Erskine, for example, is a little bit more inclusive about this. But they always emphasize this disciplinary thing, as if to become a Muslim is just concerned with practice, with doing things and discipline into a particular rigid framework. But what actually the Sufa case taught me as an anthropologist is that Islam is also very much about thinking, reasoning, about reflecting of our place in existence in the universe. So every Muslim, even if at the end of the day, of course, discipline is an important part of Muslim life, because Muslims have always to keep up with Islamic practice. A very important part in convincing them also to undergo this kind of practices comes from reflection about existence, about what life is, about what is our place in the universe as human beings, and our role as people on earth, actually. So in this sense, and here I conclude, I believe more space should be left to reflection in the anthropology of Islam. This does not mean going back to old opposition mind and body. I don't want to reintroduce this. I don't see a difference. But that an account of Muslim religious life should pay closer attention to intellectual practice as both a way for Muslims to justify their forms of commitment to an Islamic path, to Muslim path, and as a practice for cultivating a religiously grounded view of a human existence. Thank you for your attention and for your time.
Questions and comments?
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And because I just taught a class on cities and citizenship with some of the students in the room, so I was wondering whether you could link the corruption of the practice of tafakkur with urbanization. Like, it's not like we don't treat the text
in a non-authoritarian way. Then if you want to move that away, then you're moving away orthodoxy. If you move away orthodoxy, you have nothing to make an argument against. And as a Muslim that want to disagree with the tradition, I need the tradition to